Hey guys, Mochi here, and we're back with the Brigade of the Sky, a Take-Two retrospective video. So this is a video that just covering over the key cards in Brigade of the Sky that are going to be rotating out with the coming of Rebirth of Glory. So starting with the neutrals, we have Valyria. It was like a 2-play 1/1. It got traded away with pretty easily in the early game, just a 2/2 plus like a 2/3 or just a 2/2 plus like a random ping, and then you could fall behind just for playing it. And into the late game, it had to depend on your draft in order to draft like a high impact neutral card that was 7 or more so that this could fetch. So it was like overall like an okay card. It got a bit better with sort of like some Evo synergy cards. So since it was like a free body, it would be like a 2 play point 3/3 Evo that could actually like live after trading. But most of the time it ended up like around average. It wasn't like too impactful and it won't be too big of a loss. The Legendary Fighter, this was sort of like a filler plus pick. Mainly a lot of crafts just had better cards to pick in its class slots that it didn't really have to justify picking this card up. The Investigation, it was like decent fill-in like card draw. We have like Fortune's Font, like random stuff in the card pool now that sort of like simulates a sort of do nothing draw effect. This card was like reasonable even on its like 6 play point side and then like 2 play points as just a Trial of Light. The Seraphic Blade, similarly, we have sort of new cards now to fill in that removal gap. It was sort of situational as just a 2 play point remove a 2 play point cost card or less. Like sometimes it could snipe an amulet, sometimes it could snipe like a really important two play point follower, maybe something that was enhanced. But on the flip side, it could also be like a 6 play point, like kill something. It was a bit inefficient in that regard, but it was reasonable as like a removal on both sides. The Genesis of Legend, this card was a pretty cool fill-in. Like any craft could basically use it as long as you like cared about board or put enough stuff on board. You could make use of its effect over a couple turns. It denied some Evo turns really well and just forced a lot of vanilla stuff to not trade into it, and they had to like rely on pings or just develop in a unconventional way in order to avoid you getting like a ton of value off like your free Banes like chipping in. The Lowain, just a really good card advantage engine, just giving you the 2/1 Storm and the 1/3 Rush. Just really good interaction pieces that you can just weave in on curve and then keep you up in the value game as well, just because they gave you the next one after. And then eventually just get the 5/6, and then you can get a free value trade off that fairly easy, just because it trades pretty well into anything that's like 5/5 or lower, and then gives you like an extra like free AoE to give you free attack or like free heal. Those were all like super strong. And the fact that this card there wasn't much cost to pick it. You just picked it as like a 3.122 that drew you a bunch of cards that also acted as removal / followers on board. The Kai'Sa, this card was sort of underrated in a sense because it was still an Evo ping. It's just there were so many good Evo pings in the neutral picks already. If you were still missing some, you would always pick it. It sort of just got bullied because of its stat line, like 2/3s nowadays. They get traded with 3 play point 3/3s, but that's no fault to this card. Just 3 play point 2/3 was still like the standard stat line back then, and also evoing like semi non-standard like a 3/4 evo, even though it does give you like a free ping or a free draw from it. It ended up being like reasonably good if you didn't have the value to sort of back it up in the neutral picks or in your class picks, but it wasn't like too amazing. The Rackam, this card was pretty amazing and throughout its entire life in Arena, just giving you a free clash ping, like a pseudo clash ping only on your turn, just being a 5/5 and then pings for 3. It cleared out a lot of random threats, just things with Bane and post Evo followers, and then it gave you like a reasonable sized body afterwards. Even after the Evo turns, you could just play it down alongside a couple other things, and the Rackam would still be a big threat because it could always essentially trade for like 6 damage, and the opponent had to remove it, or else it would probably get an efficient trade on like a bigger sized body. The Catalina, this card was pretty good as sort of like a stand-in, even though its stat line was pretty low, and then it could be picked off with like a ping plus like a removal or just a ping plus something random on board. It ended up being like reasonably fine. It still evoed like very strongly just because it could live basically anything it traded into other than like random Banes, as well as just having a pretty good stat line, just soaking 2 random followers if the opponent didn't have some unfair removal / interaction. Last up for the neutrals, we have the Proto Bahamut. So this card, like its ancestor, the regular Bahamut, it just did a really good job of just AoEing boards. In Take-Two, there weren't too many like big things to sort of clear. So this, most of the time, it just clears all the early game as well as all the post-evo, post-trading, like mid-game cards, and that generally did the job. It's mainly the more aggressive your deck is, the more you didn't want to pick it, because aggressive decks, they didn't want to wipe their own board, and sometimes you wanted to be like a faster mid-range deck and just establish stuff on board, keep stuff on board, eventually win the game off the tempo game. So Proto Bahamut was sort of an awkward card to play there because it would wipe your own board, and then the opponent could just play a hard removal, and then they could just reset on board and just establish again. But the more defensive your deck is, the more you sort of wanted it, and the really controlling crafts definitely wanted it quite a bit. And it was always like a reasonable card to pick just because it gave every craft like sort of a 3 damage AoE that it was pretty hard to play around for the most part. So moving on to the Forest Craft cards, the Fairy Refuge. This card sort of was overshadowed by the Fire Sprite Grove sort of in the early game, and even when that rotated out, it was sort of slow as like a fairy generator. Forest Craft was more leaning towards value, and they'd always want to play like Water Fairy instead for the one drop, but it still had its implications as usually like the Yawn where you could like stun a random follower. Like if the opponent established something really big, you could do a combo and then Yawn the big follower and then try to tempo them out from there and try to make that big follower a non-factor by continuously removing their stuff, and it ended up being like pretty okay. It's still like it was still like reasonably reasonable utility card for like its cost, as well as like a decent fairy generator. The Devil Flower, as soon as Canyon of the Dragon rotated out, this card sort of fell off. Mainly because it's not good to sort of have a tech card in your deck, even though it's like a 2-play point 2-1. The fact that you're sort of like a fairy-based craft or a 1-1 base craft, just having another sort of 2-1 in your deck that doesn't generate value on Fanfare as a situational tech card meant that opponents could just trade with it like really easily for free, just kill the 2-1 and then your other 1-1s. Like it wasn't very strong on board, which is the main problem with this card. The Utopian Fairy, buff Forest, was never sort of a thing. It was better in Take 2 just because of like you could sometimes randomly get the Forest Defender combo off or just randomly buff something. Sometimes the heal was nice, but it was really inefficient for what it did. Like 2-play point 2-2 was still fine as like a filler card that randomly had some like free upside with it, so it was like a reasonably good pick. The Myconid, this card was a fairly decent card, just getting you the chip damage early and the chip damage late, as well as just hiding in the mid game just because it couldn't be interacted with just from its ambush. There wasn't a lot of AoE or just random targeting like there is sort of now. That's sort of coming into the pool, but luckily it dodged most of that, and it was like a reasonably strong pick. The Shuman Shama, this card was very strong, just being sort of a 5-play point. You could skip your Evo by generating the 2-play point ping. Sometimes the heal was also important, or you can just play it down on 3 and just save the ping for later. Most of the times the sort of unkilling spell, the attack reduction spell, wasn't really that used, but it was still like a decent flexible option. The Sutera and the Mitera, these cards were 2 of 4's best Evo ping cards, just generating a lot of value, just drawing a card or the Clash drawing a card, as well as the AoE for the Sutera was really good against things like Sword or the Forest Mirror. The Mitera just cleared a lot of really big threats, as well as just generated a ton of value on its own. The Burst Shot, this card was sort of like a Will of the Forest, like ping multiple things kind of card. It had like some win condition applications as well, but it never really like scaled too amazingly. Sometimes could end up like finishing off your opponent, but mainly it was just sort of the early game. It was sort of clunky, but you could always like clear something random and then establish maybe a fairy or like a random 2-drop after. It was sort of expensive for what I did, but most of the times these effects costed like 4 or 5, and it was like a reasonable sort of filling card. The Witherwood Guardian, it got power creeped in a sense after with the 4-5, the Force Defender, but it was still like a reasonably statted follow. Like 3-6 is a very beefy stat line, and it like traded reasonably well when it evoed. It was mainly like a consistency of getting like the free pings off. Sometimes it ended up being fine, and you could get like a random ping, but we have Force Defender for that now, and it's like a pseudo similar role, even though its stat distribution is different. The Korwa, this card was a really strong card in Forest Craft, just giving you like random buffs, so you can put it on like 2-2s, like 2-3s, just let them trade better, and eventually the fills you could like put them on for like double attacks, even on like 1 attack or 2 attack followers. They could like scare your opponent just because you had like a random Utopian Fairy or like a random buff that you can put on your followers and get like a really strong attack off. Even something like an Owlbear that could be hiding, you could get like a really strong double attack off, or like some Storm Potential finishers that you could double up on. So the God Hunter Selwyn, this card sort of highlights the problems of like combo cards on curve. Like playing this on turn 5, 6, or 7, it was hard to get its combo off. You notably had to keep fairies/wisps in your hand, and neither of them which you could guarantee both generating and keeping them in your hand, because you might have had to play them out to tempo people out. And then like getting the super AoE, sure, it could be nice, but it was way too inconsistent to get off just playing 4 cards before this. As a bonus, it could have filled in as 2 play point 3 damage removal, but every craft basically got those in like the silver and bronze picks. You never wanted to default to the legendary/gold picks to actually pick this up, so it was like reasonable filler with like some active combo implications to it, but it wasn't like super amazing because it couldn't get off its combos too consistently. So the Owlbear, this card suffered from Divine Retribution being in the format alongside it for a very long time. Just playing this down and not fanfaring, not affecting board in any way, and the opponent being able to clear it for free and then reverse snowball you or just tempo you out from there was something that was very detrimental for Forest trying to close out the game. It still was very strong if the opponent didn't have it or after it rotated out, because the opponent has to like play down wards or use some really premium random removal to clear it, and most of the times that didn't exist, so you just play it down, do your 14 points of chip, and you could win the game off that. Additionally, it was like reasonably strong in sort of the sword meta, where it could actually like AoE some tokens like the Weathered Vanguard. So last up for the Forest Craft cards, we have the Sky Divine Horror. This card was very good in Forest Craft when it was being super aggressive, just against the Lion Havens and the pre-Monica Rune Crafts. It could actually go toe-to-toe with Swordcraft as well, competing for aggro or competing for board. And just being a lurking top deck, just deal 14 points of chip damage and just win the game off that. But it's not like Owlbear where it's telegraphed and the opponent can actually play around it with a ward/removal. This one's just 6 damage to face as long as the opponent doesn't have ward. And you can even play it on a snowballing/neutral board. And it might do 12, or the opponent might have to clear everything, or else they'll lose off the snowball/the incremental chip damage. So moving on to the Swordcraft cards, Sellsword Lucius. This card was sort of strong in its early days, but it got more clunky as time went on. Mainly because it was like a one play point card that you sort of didn't want to play on one, but it was also sort of like a situational card that you wanted to keep in hand. You could always just play it down on 5, like after the opponent evoed something, and then you could get the freebie off that. But it wasn't like really strong tempo. The opponent could like ping this off for free, and then board always sort of liked snowballing quite a bit. So this card was sometimes a bit slow, a bit situational to play because you sort of wanted to save it for more value, but in the end it was like a reasonably like solid card. You always played it as sort of a 1 play point card when you needed to curve out early, as well as just playing it as like a 5 play point removal. Just the flexibility of just having this card as a top deck, as well as just some mid-game removal, was always very nice. The Grand Auction, this card was very surprising, just the amount of utility this card had. You could discard treasure tokens, just random cards you didn't care about, especially like the low drops Sword always drafted, so you could just throw them out towards the late game, and you could always play these cards very flexibly. Grand Auction was very cheap. You could get the Age-Worn Weaponry, which you could always like buff stuff and just randomly put random soldiers on board for extra chip damage late, and just cycling deeper in your tier deck was always very strong. Speaking of something cycling into your deck, that's Tycoon, 2 play point 2/2 commander, which was sometimes relevant, as well as just being the 7 play point 5/5 that just drew a couple cards. It got a little worse with like treasures, as well as Sword maybe defaulting to more of a value oriented role, just having a lot more reactive cards in your hand, as well as not wanting to dump as many cards or draft bigger cards. But it was still like a reasonably strong card, even drawing like 1 or 2 cards. 7 play point 5/5 like draw 2, and it was especially strong in the sort of earlier days Brigade of the Sky / Omen of 10 era of Swordcraft. The Age-Worn Weaponry, it's mainly covered with like Grand Auction. It was just like a flexible card. This card wasn't actually very good when you drafted it on its own, mainly because it didn't have the Grand Auction cycle attached, as well as just getting rid of the cards you didn't want, like the free treasure cycle. But it's still like a reasonably strong card, just because of like it could randomly be like a Nightfall, just giving you 2 Ophlates Knights over a couple turns that were hard to interact with, as well as like the free attack buff, free defense buff. Sometimes that could get you over stuff in a pinch or give you a free trade. So the Tanya, this card could never really shine, mainly because of its low attack total. It wanted to sort of hit face because of its high attack, but it also wanted to trade with followers because of the Bane. And then the Bane didn't really make use of its high attack because it could trade with anything anyway. And then it couldn't really hit face very well, just because you run the risk of just randomly dying to a free ping. But it interacted pretty well with Ivory Sword Dance, just hiding against random stuff and just pinging for a lot because of its reasonably high attack, and you could just evo it over stuff, be sort of like that budget Leod. But we have like the Vega Bound Frog to sort of do that job now in the future. But it was still like a reasonably solid card, sort of in the aggressive sense. But it was sort of a fallback to like other 3 drops that you could pick most of the time. The Charlotte, similarly with like other 2/3s in the format, it sort of got outclassed by like 3/3s, but it was still like reasonably strong in Swordcraft, just randomly getting that damage immune bubble. Sometimes you could dodge an Evo ping, sometimes dodge something, and the ward could always protect like low drops, protect like something really priority that you wanted to keep alive. So the Princess Tina, I'm glad that they have like cards like these printed, just randomly rewarding you for drafting like 1-drops that you might not want to draft. Sometimes it could sort of fill in as sort of that Floral Fencer sort of effect, 4 play point 5/5 Evo, and then you'd get like a 1/1 at the end. It had the awkwardness of like pulling something you might not want it to have pulled, like maybe the Rapier Master or like the Sellsword from your deck. But most of the time it ended up being okay. You could pull the Quick Blader even though it wasn't too optimal. It filtered your deck out of like sort of your bad cards, the bad 1-drops that you didn't want to draft most of the time. And even as sort of like a 4 play point 3/3, it was like sort of acceptable as like a filler 4-drop with some potential upside. The Dia, this card was like pretty good as sort of an Evo ping that gave you like the free storm, or sometimes you could just draw a bunch of cards off it, even though its stat line was sort of like unconventional, just being like the 1/1 that generated the 2/2 that was like a 2/4. It still ended up being like reasonably good as an Evo ping. The Sky Gladiator, this card was sort of a cheese card in Swordcraft. It was very understated, it didn't trade very well, but sometimes you could just overwhelm your opponent with a bunch of unattackable officers. You just chain alongside this card, and if the opponent can remove it with either AoE or a bunch of value removal alongside it, you could just win the game off having a bunch of unattackable officers just hitting into the opponent. So the Dragonites, this card was a very premium card for Swordcraft to pick, just giving you the flexible options in the mid game, and then in the late game you get like the double pair with the extra synergy. Sometimes you might even like choose something else for like a different stat line / a different keyword combination, but most of the times it was the two synergy pairs, and it was like reasonably strong for whatever you needed. Just getting the free trade or alongside the Bane body, as well as like the free storm when you needed it for either face damage or like extra pressure. So the Zeta, I said this before, this was one of Sword's best golden legendary picks, just because of the amount of pressure and value it gave. Just six play point, 6/5, just trades into things really well. It lived most of the time, and then gave you the 4/2 that could basically give you guaranteed face damage, or it could even trade in a pinch. So the Iron Fist, this card was reasonably strong as sort of a value card for Sword, just drawing one card off it. It was outshined by Spartacus for most of its life, just being sort of a similar card that just drew an extra card, as well as gave you like that minor like alternate win condition attached to it. But this card had sort of a better stat line, as well as even like evoing you, giving a random freebie in value. The enhance wasn't always that good, just because Swordcraft never really had that many big followers to sort of take. Most of the times they just picked a lot of 2-drops, 3-drops. They didn't have a lot of big drops to actually default to that they actually wanted to draft. So the enhance 9 was sometimes wasted, and you'd only like discount or 2 or 3 drops. But regardless, it was still like a good value card in that sense. And with the enhance 9 as sort of a minor upside to like playing it late game. So the Lowain, this card was actually not as good in Take 2 as it was in Constructed. Maybe because of the Oathless Knight side of this card, you could always just draft more Oathless Knights or just draft it instead of this. As well as sort of the late game implications of this card. If you were winning the game by a ton, this wasn't too much different than actually playing like something really high value in the late game. And then if this card was like played on a neutral board, if the opponent can clear it, and then they could always like keep up on tempo against like all your other stuff, then if you didn't have the rushes or storms to abuse the Lowain trigger and actually get like a bunch of free soldiers from it, then it was like super vanilla, and you just played like you had to get away with playing a vanilla 8 play point 8/7. But if you could abuse it, if you did have the swarm, the random things on board, or even play like a bunch of 1 play point like random stuff to actually get the freebie off the extra storm, then it was like reasonably strong, and it got better over time as Sword actually deterred to being more defensive or more value oriented. Next up, we move on to Rune Craft, probably one of the biggest losers of Brigade of the Sky moving out. Mystic Rune, this card was a pretty cute card. You played it as basically the 5 play point. Either you get the free golems off it, or you get the free healing / draw. Most of the times it was the golem just for the board pressure, as well as just being easier to proc. This card was interesting because it procced off the opponent doing stuff, which wasn't very reliable. But another cool thing you could have done with it in the past was you could actually chain your random Earthrights to it, and then you'd proc it yourself. So you could always like play this alongside a Grand Spire, and you get the free Earthright proc from this, as well as just the free Earthright benefit from whatever Earthright card you use to enable it. And then that was like reasonably strong as a tempo play. It was mainly just the consistency of getting it off, and as well as the opponent, they could always just not trigger the Mystic Rune, either playing the follower or playing the spell. While it could like deter your opponent from doing something, which was a benefit for you, sometimes you'd just rather just have the free followers, like the free unconditional, just summon the followers or just draw the extra cards. So this card was like sort of situational in that sense. The Anna, this card was very strong, mainly just because Rune had a lot of evos to work with. This card actually got a stronger ping when it evoed, so it would be like a 4/3 that could ping 3 randomly, and that could actually sort of fill in as sort of an evo ping in a pinch, as well as being really efficient. Like you play this alongside a Genius, and then you could trade this in and then clear some 2 mid-range threats, and that was like reasonably strong. The 2/1 stat line did hurt it quite a bit, mainly just dying for free. It was one of the avenues where the opponent could like snowball you for free in the early game. If they got a free trade off this, then it can make you fall behind and then lose, even though you didn't have enough, even if you had some really high value evo cards in your deck. The Grand Spire, this card sort of got overshadowed by like new removal, like the Witch Snap, which actually generated extra value from it. Sometimes it was good as like just random chip damage. Sometimes the 4 damage did matter, proccing the Earthrights did matter. But Rune has enough removal in sort of the 2/3 drop department that it doesn't really care too much about this one going away. So the Clarice, this card was sort of the tech card Rune Craft picked for the Moras, the Prime Artifacts, the random last words that were really problematic. The problem was just sort of keeping this card in hand to actually wait for the cards that your opponent might actually not have. And if you played this card down, just being a 3/1, 3/1, it just had a lot of vanilla implications where this card just died for free, and then it was just free tempo advantage for your opponent, just dying to soldiers or random pings the opponent had, and they could like snowball again from there. The CAG, this card was probably Rune's second best Evo ping next to its Monica. It just gave you free Evos in the late game. The Ars Magna could hit face as well as heal you in a pinch, and just the reasonable stat line, as well as sometimes even dumping it down for the free Earthright. It was all like reasonably strong in tandem with each other, and just a really strong Evo ping that Rune Craft will definitely miss, even though it does have a ton, and will probably default back to sort of like the Tetra as one of its other go-to non-Monica Evo ping cards. The Vesper, this card was pretty interesting, just being sort of the Hollow Golem effect, / like magic missile that drops Earthright, Witch's Cauldron, and it was like reasonably strong. Just if you had sort of a lot of Earthright in your deck, a lot of random sigils, a lot of random stuff. Sometimes that didn't line up, and this card was pretty vanilla. But you sort of picked it as sort of that random conditional upside with your like Witch Snaps, your like Rabbit Mages that give you like freebies, and this card could be like a reasonable card. So the Burgeoning Genius, this card was actually not as strong as you may think, sort of in the early days of Brigade of the Sky. Mainly like just picking a bunch of Abyss Summoners, picking a bunch of Burgeoning Genius. They are both lost to sort of the same things. Just a really wide swarm that you sort of played around because you had to wait for the under 20 to actually kick in for the Genius. And you played around Abyss Summoner sort of the same way, where you went extremely wide. And then if the opponent couldn't Staff of the Whirlwinds, or you played around Staff of the Whirlwinds a bit, then you could just actually deny the Burgeoning Genius from being good. And you could even potentially deny the Abyss Summoner from being good. But regardless, like as soon as this reaches the late game, like later in the game, like turns 6, 7, just getting the freebie evolve. This is just a 4 play point, 5/5 rush with extra ward attached, or you could just evo something else for like evo ping synergies or just random evolve synergies. So this card was definitely very strong. As well, you just play this as like the 4 play point 3/3 that generates the evo earlier. So just being sort of that evo recovery effect for Rune Craft definitely propelled it to being one of the strongest crafts in sort of this era. Don't get too far ahead of yourselves, because we still have Paula in the pool, which will technically generate the Burgeoning Geniuses. So this card won't be rotated out completely in that sense. The Peacemancer, it's been a while since something like Grand Gargoyle was a really good card in Rune, but just being a very good stand-in bronze card, like it could always cycle as sort of a trial-like card, just being the Accelerate, or you just play down on 5 and it was a really respectable body, the 4/5 ward that could protect you in the late game, as well as just have a very strong vanilla evolve, so like 6/7 complements removal very well, as well as threatens on board. The Fate's Hand, this card was never really good in Take 2, mainly because of the work you had to put in for it, as well as the lack of wanting to draft a lot of spells. You had to make this like 2 or 3 cost to be sort of playable, and even then Rune Craft had like a bunch of options that could actually like draw cards / pseudo draw cards that could either do it better or do it less situationally. The Mystic Seer, this card was pretty interesting throughout its life in Arena. Mainly the problem with playing it after was actually milling it out, because you'd be sort of at like 15 to 20 cards as soon as you played this out, and then you could actually like run the risk of like playing too many cards at once, and this card would just draw 2, draw 3 every turn alongside your natural draw, and then you might actually run out of cards and lose the game off the Reaper. But other than that, if you sort of managed your cards very well, you could always just draw 1, draw 2 off this alongside your natural draw, and this card would be a very strong refill card that could also like draw you deeper into your threats, as well as give you some like minor spell boost potential alongside it. This Despondent Chimera, this card was like underrated by a lot of people, but like rightfully so, because it basically did nothing. Like sometimes maybe you could get the spell boost 3 clause on it, but most of the times you wouldn't get more unless you had like the onion patches or just like a really strong spell boost deck to get the extra freebies alongside it. But even just being a 6.66, it was a reasonably strong like vanilla faller to take. So the Miss Miranda, ironically, I think it was strongest post nerf in Steel Rebellion, when it had sort of like more targets that generated a lot of things like the Hannah, things like the Shirati Butler cards that could actually give you multiple Mysteria triggers at once, and then could be like an Evo ping for like 4 or 5 with like a bunch of value attached. But regardless, this card was mainly sort of like the Mysterious Synergy Matters card that sort of gave you a lot of reward for just drafting a bunch of Mysteria. Sometimes it lined up, a lot of times it didn't, and then if you did have that sort of Mysteria deck, it would end up being like especially premium. So the Abyss Summoner, I don't think this card needs much introduction. This card single-handedly propelled Rune Craft to sort of a tier 1, tier 0.5 status for a while when it was 7 play points, and then it had like Monica and Paula to sort of fill in after its nerf, where this became sort of a really solid role player, just putting a ton of stats on board, either being a 10-10 or 11-11 total, for being either 7 play points or 8 play points. This card was incredibly strong, and the under 20 clause was always met just because of the turn it came down. Just being in the late game, giving you a massive pile of stats on board, and just chaining them together, it just overwhelmed your opponent. And it was one of the reasons Rune was sort of the best craft, or one of the best crafts in sort of this era. Next up, we got Dragon Craft. The Dragon Huntress, this card was sort of situational to get off, even though the Bane was like freebie upside, and it was on like a 2/2 vanilla. It wasn't like super amazing because it didn't really get its freebie trade off a lot of the time, and the opponent can always ping it in for free, and it came down in the early game a lot where it did basically nothing. But that was still fine as like a 2-drop, but Dragon Craft has like a lot of good 2-drops now that doesn't need like a situational one. The Hatchling, similar to Dragon Huntress, it just came down as a vanilla most of the time, and it was still like fine as sort of that filler, but it was still a waste in that sense of a silver pick. Still had that utility of being a really good late game ward, as well as the late game AoE that sometimes was good against something like Forest, something like Sword, where it could actually like clear a ton or just be a very, very big ward. So the Venom Tail, this card was actually a very good defensive body for Dragon Craft to take. Just the 1/3 ward that deterred evolves, that was actually pretty annoying to remove with like 2 drops or just random stuff on board. And they didn't want to like waste hard removal on it because it technically wasn't a threat. But it just got overshadowed by a lot of sort of proactive plays that Dragon had on 3 that could actually like snowball boards or actually like push for board that sort of Dragon was leaning towards. But it was still like good in the ramp decks. It was still like a good fallback 3-drop to take. So the Eliza, this card was like reasonable as just a 3.32 rush in the early game. And in the late game, it'd just be a 3.43 rush, and then it will always scale from there. Force your opponent to remove it awkwardly and just get the free trade off that. That was like reasonably strong. The Sanctum, this card was always interesting in sort of the Trample or the Whirlwind. The ramp was always like a free implication you could have if you had like a lot of good payoff in the late game, but mainly sort of the Trample and the Whirlwind. Those were some like really decent premium effects, even though you had to wait for them. The Pyram, this card wasn't exactly an Evo ping, but it sort of worked that way. If you Evoed it on turn 5, turn 6, you just trade this in as a 5/5 and then get the free ping with the Blazing Breath, and then you'd have the Lightning Blast in the late game to deal with either really big or really problematic threats. The True Dragon, this card was a very interesting Dragoncraft card. It jumped you from one of the most awkward pre-overflow turns in Dragoncraft, just jumping from turn 5 to turn 7 and triggering your overflow for all your mid-game followers. Think stuff like your Berserker, your Griffin Back Riders, just allowing you to actually play those down where they might have been actually rotting your hair and are really awkward to play out on turn 6. And in the late game, it was like a 5.55, which was very good stats, as well as giving you some free defensive utility, which was pretty strong. It was mainly like the mid game, which is, sometimes it ended up being bad, being like the 5/3, and it couldn't trade well. But it was still like a good follower just because it had that ramp and it had that late game implication. The Tail Swing, this card was a very strong random-based removal card for Dragoncraft. They have Overwhelming Crush now to sort of fill in the void, but this card was a bit different. It hit randomly, but it hit the strongest follower, so most of the times that ended up being fine. It also had that discount implication where it could discount something really big, or in the past it discounted Canyon of the Dragon, and then you could like play that down on turn 6 and then overwhelm your opponent by 1 turn earlier Canyon. The Warbreaker Dragoon, this card just traded into stuff very well. Just trading in, living, as well as giving you some free discounts on either expensive stuff that you can play earlier or just a bunch of mid-game, early-game stuff that you can weave into curve more efficiently and just tempo people out with higher attack totals as well. We're going to actually get a 6-play point pseudo 5/5 soon with the Rock card coming in Rebirth of Glory, which is the 3/3 that gets a free Evo for free. So that card can sort of simulate this effect, as well as being bronze and as well as being a very strong fill-in like 3.33. The Albacore, this card was just mainly too vanilla for its own good. You never wanted this card to be sort of your big game payoff just because it was sort of easy to remove and the payoff was only you healing a bit, which wasn't too big of a deal. It was still like a reasonable big follower if you had nothing else to sort of fall back to. Then Dralamak, this card mainly just had problems of just having enough spells to cast for its 7 play point side. If it was just sort of a 3 play point draw 2, it was like reasonably okay, but Dragoncraft always had some other premium draw options to sort of take over this card. And just being that 7 play point like 1/6 or 2/6, it wasn't good enough in that sense. And the card draw department wasn't like too overbearing to actually warrant picking this a lot. The Poseidon, this card will definitely be very missed in Dragoncraft. Just having the free 1/3s on board to protect this, protect your other followers, protect the Poseidon. This card always traded in very well, as well as just hit face really well, being a very strong follower and just giving you a ton of value on board as soon as you played it. And it could always be that 1/3 in a pinch to protect sort of your Doting Dragon Newts, your Byrons, and for those constructed level aggro starts that Dragon sometimes drafted. Zoe, it was sort of like an insight for Dragoncraft. It's sort of late game implications, barring like the Tail Swing, like random discount combos. It was like sort of hard to wait for, and a lot of the times it sort of rotted in hand because you didn't sort of have that right option to actually go in for that random kill because you can chain a bunch of storms together, because most of the time this was sort of the only storm in your deck and you still had to wait for it to draw and just play in an opportune time. But it was still like a reasonably cool card, and sometimes it could always do some like really cool things. Moving on to the Havencraft cards, the Father Punishment, this card actually had a lot of life put into it with Saintly Core, and to a lesser extent the Elysian Saint Hairs, which made you want to potentially draft 1-drops more. Speaking strictly to the Saintly Core, you just play the Saintly Core on turn 7, and then the next turn you get like a really premium double kill / banish effect with the Father Punishment killing something, and then the banishing the other biggest thing. And that was actually relatively strong. But in the cases where the Saintly Core didn't exist or you don't draft it in your deck, this card was like inefficient just because it didn't evo for stats, and then you'd have to like wait for the opponent to actually have like a really good clear for it, maybe actually get the ping to trade it into something as well. And it wasn't like good playing it down as like a 1-play.11. So it was like pretty bad in the other cases. The Petra, this card was pretty interesting as sort of the Goblin of Havencraft, either being sort of aggressive in the early game if you wanted to go that route, just like 1-2 into like 2-2, maybe try to win the game off aggro potential, or towards the late game where you could put this on maybe a Bearing or a Sanctum Keepers and try to actually get them to dodge removal, and then they'd be able to live because they couldn't be attacked. The Seal Tomb, this card was always a reasonably strong fill-in, just drawing you one card sort of delayed into the late game, or you could always get the Forbidden Teachings or the Falcon from it after, which wasn't too bad because you only had to wait one turn for both of them. So it was actually like a reasonable fill-in card. It wasn't like amazingly strong, but it wasn't like a bad card either. The Hazen, this card was pretty interesting after Whiteheart came in, mainly because it could hit in as the 5/4 and not take the damage, and then it sort of be threatening after. It's mainly in the 1/3 stat line. Like, the ward was actually pretty good in the late game, but the 1/3 stat line held it back a lot because the stat line was very bad in Havencraft just because of just pings and just random stuff not being as plentiful in Havencraft to actually like clear things that traded away with the Hazen for free. The Lorena, this card was sort of like the Priest of Cudgel, just giving you the random, most of the times it was a fist, so you just trade this in 4/4 into something, and then you ping something for 4 because of the Lorena being the 4 attack thing after. And then sometimes it could be like that heal if you had that sort of random Elena / Tenko kind of deck going for you, but most of the times that didn't really exist. We didn't have Elena in the pool with this card, and the Tenko decks were too inconsistent to draft. The Bashful, this card was actually a reasonable aggro card, just giving you the free ambush on turn 5, or just being a reasonable thing that you could attack with things, and then it would heal a bit after. Mainly the aggro implications of playing this down on 5 and hiding for a turn were pretty strong for this card, but even as like a 3-drop, it was reasonably solid. The Sophia, this card wasn't very good, mainly because of its stat line on Evo. It didn't get anything on Evo, and Havencraft wasn't very good at sort of keeping boards, so most of the times it'd just be a 2/3 that Evos into a 2/3, and it doesn't bring anything back, or at best it brings back like a 2-drop, which isn't like too amazing and not actually worth like sacrificing the Evo stat line for. The Prism Swing, this card alongside Unicorn Knight and Assault Priest were what I called the sort of big 3 of Havencraft mid-game removal, where you could remove 2 things at once, and then you'd punish your opponent from trying to actually establish 2 mid-range followers on board to try to like play around the Zealot. And even like earlier when there were a bunch of lines in the pool, you'd use this as one of your premium line removal cards that generated you the line, and then it just added another one to the pool to actually like try to draft that critical mass of lines to actually overwhelm your opponent with those 4/4 lines at the end of the game. The Angelic Idol, we sort of have a fill-in with this card with the Featherfolk Gardener, like the 5.3/5. It actually gives a Amulet proc alongside it as well, and they both have the sort of Amulet procking and then Evo clause on it, but it still had some like implications just being a 5/5 ward that was good at defending you for free, and it was like above average stat that way. But it won't be like missed too much, mainly because it couldn't be used in sort of the aggressive / mid-range trying to win the game off the board sense. The Dillaphil, I've talked about this card a lot before, mainly just Havencraft not having a lot of ways to abuse it. Sometimes it could just run away with the game if you could like keep a lot of random stuff on board, and this could incrementally snowball or just give you a bunch of random free trades. But most of the times it was like around above average, mainly just because sometimes the heal helped you, but it wasn't like too amazing in that sense. Themis Purge, just a free reset button on turn 8, just clearing everything on board. Sometimes it wasn't as good in the sort of not aggressive decks, but the mid-range decks that wanted to win on board, maybe generate like a bunch of amulets on board and then win the game off that, or like play a Sanctum Keeper or 2. But otherwise, like the more defensive, the more control your deck is, or maybe you draft a win condition and you want to like stick that and win the game, it ended up being like reasonably strong in those sort of defensive decks. The Garuda, this card was very situational to actually go off because you had to have a lot of amulets sort of line up to actually have a massive discount on all of them to either get value off that or just kill your opponent for lethal off proccing a lot of them at once. And it was like too inconsistent to get off because you can't really set them up. You have to play the amulets whenever you play them, and most of the times you play them as early as possible. So sometimes the Garuda will just be on board and just be a 9.66. It won't even discount anything and actually give you pings as well. The Forsaken God, this card was another interesting amulet win condition for Havencraft to have. Ironically, the same stat line as the Garuda, the 9.66. This card was actually better because we had stuff like Mori in the pool and the Forgotten Sanctuary, things that were actually reasonably strong to pull. It was mainly the problem of actually just drafting a lot of those amulets. If you drafted those amulets, your deck was pretty good in the first place, so you could actually like just draft this as a compliment. But if you had those sort of like not so good amulets that actually had to wait a long time to proc or weren't as efficient when they actually did proc, then those cards would be like really bad top decks in the early game, and you didn't really want to overload on those cards just because you'd actually like break your early games of drafting too many of like do nothing amulets. And even like playing this down, if you play this down and you draw all your like high impact amulets, this card won't actually have anything to pull in the late game. So a lot of sort of inconsistency draft wise that actually like held this card back from otherwise being like a reasonably cool like amulet win condition. Moving on to the Bloodcraft cards, we got the Reckless Parish. Just free utility, you can just ping yourself whenever you want and just draw a card later in the game. The earlier you played it, the better, just because you could cycle yourself deeper into your deck, actually draw your power cards. And then it always was like a decent card as Nightfall, giving you the free uninteractable pings and then they could be face damage, they can be pings, and it was like reasonably strong. You generally didn't play the Madness Revealed unless you had like the Vira combo, or you're trying to dodge a lethal later into the game and just heal yourself out of Vengeance / lethal ranges for some reason. The Bewitching Succubus, this card was one of my favorite cards in Bloodcraft, but I didn't like the way it ended up pinning out, mainly because it was like so awkward, like curving out with this card, like keeping this card in your hand, and you had to curve out on 2 perfectly and then 3 perfectly, and then you could play this out for like the massive payoff. Fortunately, we got the 4 play point version of this card now, which spawns the Serpents, as well as like some other stuff coming in with Rebirth of Glory, which are some sort of swarm potential cards as well for Bloodcraft. So this card won't be missed too much, but it was definitely like a reasonable like stand-in for like Bloodcraft in the value department. Alexandrite Demon, just really efficient for what it did. It drew your card, even though it was understated. You could just get the free card draw, free removal spell, and it was reasonably good, even though it had the self-ping attached, which sometimes could be a benefit. The Vira, similar to other 2-drops in Blood's Golden Legendary picks, it never really had like a huge chance to shine. Mainly if it lined up, it ended up being like super good. There weren't many like constructed level synergies to actually like mitigate a lot of self-damage, and sometimes the opponent could just clear it for free, but otherwise it like a reasonably like strong card that had like problems evoing. The Zahek, this was one of the starts of like power creep in terms of actually like vanilla stat lines. Even though this card wasn't like constructed playable, it was still like 3 play point 4/2, which is like higher than 3/2, which is the standard, and it also gave like a freebie ping with Evo, which was like all very good, as well as like the free AoE like one with the Vengeance, which was all like free upside alongside like a buzz statted follower. So it was like a good fill-in for Bloodcraft before I got like Armored Bats and like the new 3/3 that it's gonna get. The Goethe, this card was a really cool card for Bloodcraft to have. Unfortunately, it was a 3.23 most of the times, but if you got to the late game, it was relatively neutral enough. You could play it down as maybe like a 9/9, 11/11, and then hope your opponent doesn't have the hard removal / the ways to deal with it, and then you can win the game off that. If you actually got to the case where you had an Evo for this and you got to like 18, 19 health down, then your opponent could have probably killed you with like some random ping lethal, some random reach potential, and it was like too risky to get off and too inconsistent to actually have the Evo to actually win against your opponent for having that storm potential with this card. It was still a cool condition nonetheless. The Crimson Desire. This card actually wasn't too good throughout its entire life in Arena. The more closer you were to an aggro deck, the more you could sort of use this card, because it could actually simulate sort of a Forge Weaponry effect, like +2/+2, throw it on a follower. It was mainly the problem of actually keeping something on board, because everything was like too efficient at removing all your stuff, all your bats, all your random tokens on board, that you couldn't actually hit face with this. And if you were trading into your opponent's follower, it would be sort of inefficient, because Blood didn't actually have sort of a lot of Evo pings, a lot of Evo related followers to actually get an extra bonus from actually getting the Evo. So you'd be trading like a 3 play point spell alongside maybe a 4-drop, 5-drop that wouldn't actually get the free Evo ping from it, and then that just turned into like a +2/+2 rush, which we already had in the form of something like Executioner Axe, which wasn't good in that sense either. The Devil Hand, this card was actually one of Blood's best 4-drops for a while. Unfortunately, it had to wait till turn 7 to actually get all its value. Just turn 4, 5, and 6, it was really clunky just being that Goliath-sized body. But then in turn 7, sometimes maybe you could get the random ping to actually hit something that you actually cared about, and then the random buff sometimes ended up being really good. And all of that combined together ended up being like a fairly solid card, but it ended up being like a bit vanilla in the early game, and it got replaced by a lot of really good 4-drops, 5-drops for Blood to take, so you didn't really have to pick this card as highly in the future. The Narmia, this card was a reasonably strong Vengeance activator for Bloodcraft. Just playing it on the Evo turns, you'd reduce yourself to 10 and you'd get a free kill something, and then this would trade in very well, just being a 6/5 with Bane. And then afterwards, your opponent would have to deal with the Bane follower with either removal or just crashing into something, which was very inefficient for your opponent. Even in the vanilla sense, just 4 play point 4/3 with Bane, that was reasonably solid enough. It was sometimes just the Vengeance actually hurt you a lot. Like you could randomly die to like a bunch of random storm potential, a bunch of like random things hitting into you if you didn't have the healing or the random stuff to mitigate the damage. The Evil Eye Demon, this card unfortunately couldn't shine as much in Take 2 as it could in Construct, and sure, it was fine as sort of the stand-in like ping 2 play point ping 3, but then getting like the super AoE at 5 play point 5/4, sometimes it would ping for 0, but if you could ping for 1, ping for 2, and it ended up being reasonably strong, it's just like waiting on that towards the late game. Sometimes it wasn't good enough, but if you could get the synergy for it, it ended up being pretty amazing, just because your opponent would be sort of baited to actually like overextend versus you if you were being sort of inefficient with like your pings, like just randomly pinging yourself by 1 or 2, and then the opponent would try to snowball board because they could like clear everything on board, and then the Evil Eye Demon, if you had the Evo for it, you could actually like whiteboard and then maybe potentially win the game from there. The Thunder Behemoth, this card was a really interesting card for Bloodcraft again. It was like really efficient, like just 5 play point 6/6, and then they could ping for 3 for anything, but it had the downside of reducing your play points by 3 for the following turn. It ended up being like reasonably fine, just really solid stats on like 5, and then you can always like play a 2-drop, 3-drop after, and then towards the end game, most of the times the play point reduction didn't really matter as much, and this ended up being like reasonably premium follower with like some pseudo downside. The Pomer, this card got really interesting towards the end of its life in Arena, just being an 8-10 Evo that was really annoying to clear, even with its self-damage, but it was still like sort of like bad in the sense that it did have that self-damage that sometimes the opponent can rely on. But the more you were snowballing, the more you were sort of okay with this effect, and this was still very strong in the vanilla implications, just being a 6.46 board that could protect your stuff, protect your face. The person, even with its buff, it was too inconsistent to get sort of that Jabberwocky effect to actually like have a bunch of like serpents or like bats on board, and then you can like transform them into a bunch of like mid-range or like really big followers. And then like, but the storm potential ended up being like reasonable. Just get your opponent to 14 and just kill your opponent with the free person storm. It could also like trade reasonably well, just hitting in with the Bane storm and then just killing something and then potentially living on board. Moving on to Shadowcraft, the Gremmery, even pre-nerf, the Gremmery wasn't actually very good in Shadowcraft. Sure, maybe you could have some ghosts or some really efficient like skeletons or random stuff living, but in Take 2, Shadowcraft wasn't as sticky, like pre-Bone Drone, like like a bunch of other stuff that actually gave you a bunch of boards unless you had like some constructed level mid-range Shadowcraft deck. So Gremmery, most of the times it was sort of the 1-1 that you sort of had to work to actually get the inside off of, but sometimes it could end up like evoing two things and you get like a ton of value off those trading as well as getting the free draw from them after. The Soul Conversion, this card was always a nice sort of one-off to have. We always had those sort of Demon Eater ghoul effects that always like drew to, sacked something. And this one card was just the most efficient at like doing it. Sometimes you could just weave it in, like the constricted level Manifest Malice on turn 3, and then you use the Soul Conversion on the Ghost for some really efficient redraw. Saruman, this card as a joke was the first Silence card. 2 play point 2/2 was actually really efficient, even though it had a hefty Necromancy cost. It just dealt with stuff like Prime Artifacts, just your Monica Moras, just random problematic last words or effects that you want to get rid of. And this card was like a reasonable tech card, not too much opportunity cost to pick other than like other really strong 2-drops that Shadowcraft had access to. Lady Grey, this card was actually a pretty balanced Arena card. It actually had quite a bit of opportunity cost to picking it. Sometimes you ended up with stuff like Cascades or random removal, like 2-drops in your hand. You didn't have natural 2-drops to actually make use of its reanimate, and sometimes you actually had to play this out on curve like turn 2, turn 3, and then this card would die for free to like random 3/2s or like 3/3s on board. And then into the late game, this card fell off a ton, just being a 1/3 drain. This card definitely wasn't good enough. So at the cost of having a really explosive mid-game potential, this card still had some downsides associated with like early game or late game clunkiness. Danua, one of the X ones that actually didn't really care about things like puppets or tokens on board, mainly because of its clash that could actually kill it. If you actually got the Evo off, sometimes you could give the aura like random things that lived on board, and it ended up being like reasonably solid. Sometimes it just died for free to like some random 1 damage pings, which was the main downside, but it ended up being like a reasonably solid 2-drop. The Fairy, this card was mainly like a stand-in. Sometimes you would get those constructed level lethals. Maybe you have some like really big follower, like a 4/4 or 5/4 that actually lives on board and you can get the free double attack. But most of the times you won't get those like Arcus combos or actually like have some mid-range stuff live, as well as just having the board space as well as random followers in your hand to actually bury alright for it. And a lot of the times you're just pressured out to play the Fairy on turns like 2 to 8 to 9 that you actually won't be able to save this for that random late game lethal potential. The Golden Casket, this card was actually a pretty surprising card. Just being flexible enough, you could just always play this down as sort of a zombie later, as well as just playing this down for the Lich and the zombie. That was 5 play point for 6/6 stats. And then sometimes it would be fine as just the card draw option. And all those flexibly enough, even with the delay / conditional attached where something has to die. For Shadowcraft, it wasn't too bad to actually trigger. And sometimes it could even be in benefit, like hiding the Liches or hiding the card draw / healing from something dying. The Fran, just really efficient for what it did. 3 play points, you could just play it down, get 2 shadows, get the remove for 4, or you could always get the 3/2 alongside it. And then into the late game, just really premium for 7. You just play it down, get the ping 4, and then you get the 5/4 rush a lot of the time. Wraith Knight, this card was pretty cool, but mainly it was the sort of stat line that held it back. Sometimes it got cleared for free with like random tokens, random puppets, and then it wasn't very strong. And then the random ping enhance for it didn't gain any stats for enhance, so that was the main thing that sort of held it back. But it was still like a reasonable follower, like above average vanilla-wise, because it did technically die and then give you something extra value in return. The Stygian Warden, this card got worse over time, but it was still like good in sort of the cheese potential of randomly having your opponent evo something big or / mid-range into something you had, and then you could just always clear something for free, like convert like a random 2-drop or random 3-drop into a hard removal. That ended up being like super amazing, but it mainly fell off because like Dragon didn't really draft as much big stuff, and a lot of big stuff sort of fell off in fear of just a lot of high value like mid-range cards. Medium, this card was a very important card for Shadowcraft, just being a really efficient ghost generator. You could play it down for 1 in a pinch if you had to weave it alongside something and clear something really problematic and you didn't have the play points to invest for it. Or even just playing it down for 5, you get the 4/4 body alongside the ping 1. Sometimes you could clear a random token, you could clear something like an X1 that lives on board, and that ended up being like super premium, just being a free way to skip your Evo. Plague City, I always looked down on this card, but it always had sort of implications of like clearing a bunch of random stuff, as well as you being the first one able to actually like play cards afterwards. So it always had some really good synergy with like some really low drops or some multi-token spawners, and you can always like trade efficiently against your opponent since like fanfares always worked as well. Mordecai, this card was a bit inefficient for what it did, but it still did have some like really good potential if the opponent didn't have the bounce / banish removal for this card, just because it could be like that sort of wing condition card that was like the 7/7 get the Evo, and then it was really hard to remove the base Mordecai and the future Mordecai that came from it dying. Still, it had some shadow problems of being conditional to actually get the free Mordecai / Evo from it, as well as being a really clunky draw at 10. It did have some reanimate synergies, but most of the times it didn't really matter. Last up, we have Proto Craft, Ancient Apparatus. This card was a pretty interesting card. It shuffled the 3 of the best sort of mid-range artifacts into your deck, the Mystic, the Radiant, and the Prime Artifact. But mainly you had to fetch them. It got better now with something like the Mechanized Soldier, but in the past you all had to like draft some really premium cards to actually fetch the things from your deck, or you had to draft another Ancient Apparatus and then rely on the Squadron, which could be good alongside like maybe other things that shuffled Mystics or Radiants into your deck. But it was mainly clunky. It was also situational on draft as well as situational on draw. Ancient War Machine, even though this was one of the worst 2 drops in Proto Craft, it could still do some interesting things. It could get the ward from actually playing an artifact down, even though that was inconsistent. It comboed well with puppets, just the 1/4 stat line. It often lived, and then you could chain puppets alongside it to clear something, as well as have this thing live and set up other puppet clears in the future. You could always buff it, something like a Jessica, buff it, and then it trades reasonably well as a 2/4 body, and a bunch of other things. It ended up being like fine as just a standard Evo body, but definitely you still preferred like Shufflers or just other value 2 drops over it. The Paracelsus, just a really strong Evo body. You just play this down, and then you get the strike form and you can clear 2 things at once, or sometimes get the guard form if you want to protect it. Just really good value for just an Evo 2 drop, but sometimes it was just clunky in the sense that you had to play it on 2, play it on 3, and you couldn't get the value off it. The Lococo, just a really valuable transformer effect with the rotation of something like Otherworld Rift, just giving Portalcraft a really big follower removal, and then the 1/3 that you give to your opponent actually gives you a bunch of value in the process, giving you 1 puppet for sure, and then sometimes it'll give you 2 if the opponent can't clear the 1/3 on their own. The Jessica, this card actually had a lot of random synergy. Sometimes you just put it on random follower and then force your opponent to target it, as well as just putting it onto something to get a free trade. You can always put it onto puppets. You could also put it onto a puppet and just leave it to die. The puppet would carry over to the opponent's turn, and the opponent actually had to spend like ping removal on that thing, which is like a pretty cool tech that you could have done with it. Kokoro, this card couldn't be abused as much in Take 2 as it could be constructed. It was still like a very strong 5 drop, just playing it down, getting the 2/1 that randomly pings, as well as this being a reasonable ping Evo body, like the 5/4, and then it hits in and pseudo clashes for 2. But playing this on like 3 or 4, sometimes it just died for free, which is mainly the fault of this because you weren't like a constructed level Silva deck. But still, this is like a reasonably valuable 3 drop for Portacraft to have. Really good to clone with something like a Hamlin in the past. The Malokia, this card was always pretty cool. Sometimes maybe you could get the random 10 damage proc on this and get the free AoE, but a lot of the times that didn't happen. Sometimes you could always play this as like a 3 play point Dread Dragon or a threat to become a Dread Dragon plus. If you could line up some random resonance / unresonance triggers and then randomly get a bunch of card draw alongside it, maybe you can make this a 4/4 or a 6/6, and then with a little bit of work, it could end up being like reasonably strong. But it wasn't as good as the standard vanilla like 3 drops or like 4 drop, 5 drop, just random golden legendaries that ended up being better than this card. This card was always good as a reach potential card for Portacraft to have. The ward was actually reasonably strong, just 4/4 ward wasn't too far away from like a 5/4 ward, and giving you the Gilgamesh just makes it so you only have to do 15 points to chip advantage. You can just win the game off an aggressive gameplay, and that was always something Portacraft sort of struggled with, like closing out games. So just drawing the Gilgamesh for basically free as long as you can line up the resonance was definitely a very strong card for Portacraft to have as sort of like a stand-in 5 drop if you didn't have a bunch of premium 5 drops already. Speaking of premium 5 drops, the Nicola, just a really strong card, even like post-nerf to 5. You just play this down on turn 5, turn 6, and then you eventually get the 5/5 ward. You can make a snowball board for during that turn or prior to that turn, and the opponent has to deal with everything up to that point, as well as the 5/5 that spawns during that turn as well. So it's just really hard to clear, and just even on like turn 8, it ends up being like very strong. Just playing it down, you can get the 5/4 as well as the 5/5. That's really hard to clear. The Captivating Conductor. Ironically, this rotates as soon as Abyss Summoner rotates. This card was mainly just used to clear Abyss Summoners, but sometimes the opponents could just overwhelm you in terms of mid-range boards because your puppets can't keep up with that. And then sometimes they can just play a big follower alongside that, and you can clear that mid-range follower and that really big follower, and then you can get back into the game from that way. And in a pinch, you could always use it on your own followers, and like one follower of your own, and then kill another one of your opponent's followers. The Artifact Spark. This card was actually pretty cool. You could convert a bunch of random artifacts into a bunch of random pings. If you're a high density artifact deck and you could randomly get like a bunch of artifacts into your hand, then you can maybe ping your opponent for 4, ping your opponent for 8, and it ended up being like decently premium if you were sort of aggressive. But other than that, obviously it was sort of the worst pick for Proto Craft to have. I liked it in the sort of flavor sense. It would have probably been too good if you could just play the Artifact Spark for free and just have sort of that guaranteed 8 damage, playing the Spark once, converting something, and then playing the Spark again. But the fact that you had to actually have an artifact in hand to actually play this card really held this card back. Silly is probably the most important thing to leave in Brigade of the Sky after the Abyss Summoner nerf. It just basically cleared everything on board, and it traded incredibly well as well. Even though it didn't evo standardly 5/6 into 5/6, this still cleared basically everything you needed to clear. And the fact that it could banish all the problematic last words, all the random stuff on your opponent's board, it comboed extremely well with puppets. You could clear 4 defense, even 5 defense, just chaining a puppet or 2 with it after. Made it an incredibly strong card. The Silva wasn't as good in Take 2 as it was in Constructed, mainly because a lot of the time you're throwing away a 2-drop or a 3-drop, and most of the times they didn't actually have last words, or they didn't have some of that Kokoro effect where you can actually take advantage of it. And even more than that, you were actually throwing away a valuable fanfare that a lot of them actually had. And most of the times you'd only get like 4, even like 6 points of chip damage out of it. And Proto Craft didn't win a lot of games in the past out of just chipping your opponent to death. A lot of times they just controlled the game forever, and they eventually won the game off like a bunch of mid-range threats like sticking on board. But it was still like pretty fine as like that 7 play point, like pseudo finisher. You could always drop it down. It was a reasonably statted body that was ambushed, so it could also hide and like trade well or go face. I guess that wraps it up for the Brigade of the Sky video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.